Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a graduate of the University of Georgia, and she is getting her master's degree at North Carolina State University. This week in the news, the future of fair admissions. And this is a conversation Susan and I are going to have about something that was run by James Murphy, the senior policy analyst for educational reform. And we've done a first part series some time ago, and it's a 3-part series. And this one looks at legacy preferences. So Susan and I will be talking about legacy preferences. Are they right? Are they not right? Where is it going? Is it going to be outlawed? Really robust discussion I think you're going to enjoy. After that, Lisa and I will continue a 4-part series we're doing, looking at 7 groups that often feel disillusioned with the results in the college admission process. And we'll be looking at reasons 3 and 4, groups 3 and 4. And hopefully by learning this information, you will no longer be disillusioned. Our interview is with Andre Phillips, the director of admissions at UW-Madison. The topic is Understanding Wisconsin-Madison. It's part 2 of 4. And the college spotlight, Kevin Newton is back. This time, Understanding New Zealand Universities. Friends, I am here with Susan, and I'm not even going to do any chit-chatting because I'm so excited about the tip she is about to share with the rest of us. So take it away, Susan.
Oh, it's great to be here, Mark, and
thank you.
I'm delighted to kind of share some end of reading season reflections as I'm coming off of a year reading for a university. And this was the time of year, actually, when I was in full-time admissions at Bates College, a couple decades ago, that we would start measuring our success by comparing what our applicant pool had looked like, what our admitted student group looked like. We weren't quite at the enrolling period yet until May 1, but compared to the recruitment goals that we had established the previous year. And I think listeners would be interested to know that while there's a lot of reference to selective admission being a lottery, or throw the applications down the stairs in the old days and see which ones landed right side, the randomness is such a misunderstanding of this process that, and I know parents right now whose kids are getting denied and deferred and waitlisted are starting to feel like there is no rational process that this is a lottery at the most selective level. It's actually a highly contrived, pre-established plan that colleges work very hard during their recruitment season and then during their application evaluation season to meet these goals. And the admissions staff is held accountable. A report has to be shared with the faculty and the trustees. And I remember very well when I was in liberal arts admission, sitting down it was really right after May 1st when we kind of looked like what the incoming first year class, what the composition was going to look like. And we would take out all of those recruitment goals and see where we measured up. And they were all groups of students who benefited from some form of preference or affirmative action in the reading process. And I know that when we say affirmative action, we think immediately of the hot topics around race and legacy and athletes, but they're probably 20 plus
Sure.
preference categories that colleges might call hooks. They might call them tippers or institutional priorities. Hooks we think of as being really defined, quantifiable characteristics or talents, the obvious things, the Velcro, as we used to say, that would cause an application to stick while others might slide away. But institutional priorities are often not transparent to the public. And that might be because a college is losing enrollment in its own state, or only enrolls from 30 states nationally while the competing colleges enroll from all 50. It's just areas where a college or university feels it's not doing as well as the competition, and where they have potential to attract more applicants and then also kind of get the pipeline open with students enrolling. So the one category that you and I were thinking that listeners might like to hear about is geographic preference.
Sure.
And, talk about something that you as parents can't control. It's like, well, should I move to North Dakota? Or, literally, I have had families say that to me. And at our boarding school where you and I worked for multiple years, we did have students from many, many parts of the United States and other countries. So we were kind of privy to seeing how geographic preference could potentially advantage a student. A college in the Northeast is really interested in having students from the Southwest. Now, they're always Californians, right? Californians are out there.
Of course.
But the Southeast or the Southwest or parts of the Midwest or the Great Plains states, those kids don't travel perhaps as much as kids in other states, whatever. But the colleges that I've worked for, that I've read applications for, were very attentive to recruiting and then looking specifically for strong students in areas where they weren't well represented. So the joke always is, oh, we enroll students from 49 states. I remember the Amherst College representative saying that once at our school. And of course, what's the next question that all the kids ask?
What's the state you don't have?
And it was almost always one of the Dakotas. Seriously, I kid you not.
Yeah.
So all things being equal among applicants, would a student from a really underrepresented geographic area get the nod? There was some Velcro there.
Mm-hmm.
Over an applicant from a feeder state. So, a great example when I worked at Bates, which is a, selective liberal arts college in Maine. At that time, only about 10% of the students at the college came from the state of Maine, because it was a fairly low socioeconomic state at the time. I think things have improved a little bit, but we had to work harder in our own backyard. And we sure favored applicants in the application review. And it wasn't that these kids were unqualified. It's just that we had many, many well-qualified students to choose from. And they were not getting in. We admitted about a third of the kids who applied. So we would fall all over ourselves to honor rural kids from our own state who, smart as whips, but might not have had all the bells and whistles as a prep school kid, or even a kid at a high-end public high school elsewhere in the Northeast, where Bates traditionally enrolled, an enormous percentage of its student population. So as parents think about recruitment goals, in fact, I just read something on a Facebook listserv thing today where a parent was saying, well, how can I plan? How can I find the colleges that are going to favor my student?
Mm-hmm.
very legitimate question. Well, if your son or daughter is a nationally ranked debater or an all-state French horn player, or we can think of lots of examples of high talent kids with quantifiable talents, ask the college. The student reaches out to the orchestra conductor or the debate coach, obviously to an athletic coach. That's a more commonly thought of model. But you find out what they're hoping to enroll in a given cycle, and do you, as a prospective student, have the kind of credentials that will carry weight?
And Susan, talk about what we were talking about earlier, how this pertains to schools where you don't get a lot of applicants from in a given state, because we do get listeners sometimes that will write in and say, my school's brand new, does my kid have a chance? This hotshot school over here, we know they get 20 to 30 kids every year that apply, but how are they going to know me? You want to speak to that and how that fits into
absolutely
to these institutional priorities that you're describing?
So a bragging point for colleges, and this hasn't always been the case, but a bragging point, it has become how many high schools are represented in your first year class.
Yeah, I see that a lot,
right?
Reported out.
And colleges used to have a cadre of feeder schools that they depended on heavily. Talk about kind of white privilege and reinforcing a lot of historical patterns of enrollment. But as time went by, they started realizing that the diversity of high schools was almost like a diversified financial portfolio, right? That there's safety in a diversified portfolio. And if you think of the freshman class at a college or university almost as a portfolio, and you have so many competing needs and wants and balances, and the admissions staff is trying to make a lot of people happy, financially, academically, athletically, musically, you name it. So it becomes like the class becomes like a portfolio. And we used to talk about that. That portfolio has expanded a lot. But one of the areas where colleges almost all agree is the more high schools represented in your first year class, the better. That way you're not dependent on feeder schools. And you're not held hostage, the way that colleges used to be held hostage by especially prep schools that they had these long historical relationships with. So a lot of that has changed, good fodder for the discussion on affirmative action. So parents, my reassurance to you is, if you're from a school that hasn't done much business with the colleges that you're looking at, it's okay. In fact, it's good. It's a way to stand out. It's really important that the college counselor or the guidance counselor in the school understands a little bit about your college search and why you're interested in these schools, so they can support your application on their end by talking a little bit about you in a context that they may be unfamiliar with. Right.
This is really good. One of the things, Susan, I know you and I have often said before, is almost nobody really gets into a highly selective school without in some way having some hook. Now that we're using hook very broadly when we say that. We're not just talking about, traditionally when people think of hook, they think of 4 to 6 hooks, right? They think of alumni, they think of development, they think of athlete, they usually think of, underrepresented student of color, and maybe geodiversity, possibly faculty kid, but that's about as far as they go in the traditional thinking.
Right.
and they're not looking at all kinds of things, like even something like what our gender skew is.
Yeah.
And if the gender skew is really bad overall or in particular majors, then that's an institutional priority to address it. Look, not all hooks are equal. It's not the same as something else, but could it be a tiebreaker between two kids? Absolutely.
Well, and absolutely, a lot of admissions decisions are driven by the institution's needs. This is what happens when you have such a supply heavy process. We've said before on the show that about 80% of the students at a lot of selective colleges have the ratings where they could be admitted and be successful.
Mm-hmm.
So, after a college reads through the applicant pool once and kind of eliminates the students who are simply not academically qualified. Of course, every parent listening now is going to say, "Oh no, that's my kid," but it probably isn't.
Mm-hmm.
It probably isn't, because there are a lot of kids who could be wildly successful at all these highly selective schools. But then the buckets come out, and the colleges start reading and filling the buckets, which represent the institutional priorities. And at that point, the athletes, especially at a Division I or II school, get siphoned out to a whole different kind of admission process, especially if money is involved. Division III, they're not. They usually are still in the pool, but ratings may be coming in from coaches so that the admission staff understands how much the decision perhaps should be swayed by a Division III coach. Division III coaches, I was in NESCAC for years, and the coaches were limited as to how many applicants they could rate at the highest level.
Susan, just in case one of our listeners doesn't know, tell our listeners what NESCAC is. Most will, but some might not. So.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. NESCAC is the New England Small College Athletic Conference, and it's D3, so no money for athletes, but it's a pretty high level athletic conference.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? There are some D3 programs that could easily play D1 opponents and fare well. It just
it's a group of some of the most selective D3 colleges, especially the smaller D3 colleges.
You think of, Williams, Amherst, Tufts, Bates Bowdoin, Colby, Wesleyan, Connecticut
Middlebury.
College, Middlebury.
Yeah.
And something parents may not know is that these D3 colleges are allowed to have one D1 sport. And actually, don't quote me on that. When I was working in the NESCAC world, it was one. So, for example, Bates had a D1 ski team.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it may be two sports now, because I remember reading. Do you
know,
know, Mark?
Colorado College has two. They're not in the NESCAC, but they have two.
That's okay. So maybe it's depending on the conference. I don't know. But that's where I heard it, in fact, when we had that wonderful series of interviews with our Colorado College representative. So, again, so there are things that kind of bifurcate the application process for different populations. But it varies. So, for example, the university I read for this year, I never read a D1 athlete. They were gone from my geographic experience of reading. In fact, my heart often was heavy when I read the application of a student where clearly their sport was paramount to them. And I could tell in the application perhaps that they had in their contact history that they had contact with the coach. But if they were in my queue, they were not a recruit. And in that case, we had to be influenced by the fact that we had a hyper-focused athlete who was not going to be playing that sport at the D1 university. Now, if they were strong enough academically and personally to get in on their own steam, it was great. But it made my heart heavy Because why would we ever even yield that student if they were going to come to a school where they weren't going to play, or if they were going to try and walk on? The coaches try and be pretty honest by saying, well, you can try and walk on, but, we haven't had a walk on in 3 years, or, our walk-ons play freshman year and then we cut them so we can bring the recruits in, over them. It's why communication is just so important. Families communicating with their admission counselor, families communicating with their coach. Then also this year, I would read applications from very high-end musicians. And my university had a merit scholarship for high-end musicians who weren't going to major in music. And how cool is that? Right?
Well, one thing, and with this we have to transition, but one thing I always say in the podcast is that admission officers want what they don't have.
Mm-hmm.
And it's one of those things I feel I can't say enough. Obviously, we're not talking about people that will burn the building down, like not negative things, but one of the natural ramifications of this, if people are listening, is that if you want what you can't have, then if you are in an overrepresented category,
yes,
then you need to take that into consideration in how you build your college list.
That's right.
And I feel that that's where there's a lot of disillusionment. Susie, you and I are recording this here late in March. I'm starting a brand new series, starts on this Thursday. 7 groups of people I find that are often disillusioned with the results of the college process.
Wow.
And it's going to go over 4 weeks. Lisa and I are doing it. But oftentimes it's this piece here where kids are overrepresented and they may not know that they're overrepresented. Right. And it's other things too that can breed entitlement. But I don't want to give away the secret sauce here and then say what they are and get into that. I'd love to keep talking about this, but hopefully that whet people's appetite.
Absolutely. And the takeaway for parents is if your kid attends what you feel is an unknown school, right, where your school doesn't have a track record of getting kids in to, whatever college it is on your list that you're worried about, view that as a wonderful opportunity for your child to introduce that school, that community, to the colleges that they're applying to. And that can be a really awesome thing. It really can be, and it can be a standout. I think students have to think a lot and maybe talk it through about how they would do that. But I worked with a girl this year, in fact, in North Carolina, from a rural community near Asheville, who went to an ag and tech high school. And here she was then, she really wanted to go to college at like Boston College or Northeastern or NYU, or talk about the antithesis of the typical applicant to those schools, right? And she was embarrassed about her school and her background, but she had just maxed out her wonderful opportunities. And it was a fantastic hook for her. And she ended up actually being very, very successful in the process because she learned to unpack that background and talk about what led her to want to go to a large urban university instead of to, the predictable, perhaps, match in a different direction. So, be loud and proud about it if you go to if you live in a different community or go to a different kind of high school.
Yes. And you know what? I'm often prone to do this, to do a tease, as they say in the TV and the marketing world. I have a tip that's completely related to this that I want to pick up when you're on next time, Susan. It's kind of a part 2.
Yeah.
Completely spin off of this. So let's pick up right here.
Okay.
Where we left off. Listeners, you're going to have to come back in first week in May, because Susan's up first week every month and first week of April to get that. Sorry to make you wait, but it'll be worth it. We trust you. Don't trust us. It'll be worth it. So.
Awesome.
All right. So our admissions vernacular today is the word CAPS. And CAPS is just an acronym for Common App Personal Statement. Don't hear it a lot, but Occasionally I hear caps. We always have. It's crazy how many terms are out there, aren't there?
I know,
Susan?
the acronyms.
Some are used in some offices and others in other ones, but there's enough so that we're in the hundreds on doing this. And we haven't run out yet, so plenty of action. And our big number, and with this, it's going to be a segue to our article. It's 89, and our regular listeners know when you get a big number that doesn't seem that big, it's oftentimes percent, and that is true again today. So 89% of admission directors in a recent survey say that they do not support the use of legacy preferences. And that is an increase from the pre-COVID polling. So the trend line is more and more resistance to legacy admissions. And with that, we're going to transition right into our article.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
If you're really, really attentive, you may remember, but Susan and I, we did, and in the news about 4 months ago now, that was done by James Murphy, who's the senior policy analyst for Education Reform Now. And we said he did a trilogy, and then we're going to come back and go through the whole trilogy. And so the second part of the trilogy is legacy preferences. And the reason why we took a while is because Julie and I did a segment on it. Susan just informed me, I think it was episode 285. So I said, let's just put it to rest a little while. We don't want to go back to back with the same topic. What was our first one? Was it affirmative action? I'm trying to even remember, Susan.
Early decision.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, it was early decision.
Fantastic article.
Yes. Yep. That was a really good one. Early decision. So now this came out in fall of 2022. And this is also looking at the future of fair admission. So you have to understand everything we're saying is in the context of what is fair. And part of the way they're defining fair is, what's leveling the playing field so that certain people are not getting advantaged and others are getting disadvantaged. And so I really want to hear a lot of what Susan thinks about this article. So what I want to do is just quickly share 7 of the main findings from the study. And it's worth reading. We'll link it to the show notes. It's about a 15-page document, but well worth reading. And so here's some of the key findings. One is that opposition to legacy preferences is now more than 60 years old and has come from both Democrats and Republicans. It's traditionally not been a partisan issue. Another finding from the article is that more than 100 colleges and universities have stopped providing legacy preferences since 2015. And, you tend to only hear about a couple of the more prominent ones that made a big splash, like when Johns Hopkins announced, I want to say that was 2018, around there. Amherst, 2022, Pomona. But, Caltech, there've been a lot of the big ones you hear about MIT, but there's actually 100. Another key finding, 75% of Americans, and as I said a second ago, 89% of college admissions directors do not support the use of legacy preference. Here's another one. 787 colleges and universities reported providing a legacy preference in 2020. Now, that's approximately half of the 4-year institutions that complete the common data set, but it's 80% of the 64 4-year colleges and universities that admit less than a quarter of their applicants. So amongst highly selective, especially private, 80% currently using legacy preferences. 3/4 of public colleges and universities do not provide legacy preference. So there is a skew here when it comes to public versus private. And there are just 5 states where a majority of the public institutions of higher ed offer an advantage to legacy kids. And those 5 states are Maryland, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Virginia, and Rhode Island. 16 flagship universities provide a legacy preference. It was probably about a year and a half ago, we had another in the news on legacy preference when Colorado became the first state to ban legacy preference. We did a segment on that. Another point, children of alumni have a significant advantage in the admission process at colleges with legacy preference. So it describes some stats on Harvard. At Harvard, legacy applicants with the highest academic ratings were more than twice as likely to be admitted than applicants who had equally high ratings but came from households below 60,000. And then the last of the key findings I'll share, and then I'll make one more point and turn it over to Susan. Many highly ranked colleges and universities enroll more legacies than they do Black kids. And the article goes on to say that if the Supreme Court bans the consideration of race in college admissions and colleges do not end the use of legacy preferences, the enrollment gaps will grow even larger. So the article does go look at the history of legacy preferences, tracing it back even into the 20s and showing how it had been used to exclude Jews who were rising at some selective schools at a rate that was concerning to people who were seeing less spots for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And one way to curtail that is to say, we'll give a legacy advantage. You know, it talks about that a little bit in the article. And the other interesting thing, and I'll say this, and then I want to hear your thoughts, Susan. You can take it wherever you want to go. The article does go through and trace the history of states that have banned race-based affirmative action. And it shows that almost every time when race-based affirmative action was banned, legacy was also banned. They show it in California, they show it in Texas, they show it in a number of states. And that has real significant ramifications for what we all expect will be a curtailing, if not a complete eliminating of race as a factor, as one factor of many in the admission process. So it's a really hot issue because if affirmative action is overturned, it's almost inevitable this is going to be where things are going to go immediately. Ketanji Brown Jackson, one of her arguments in the opening hearings was, so some people's disadvantage is not able to be considered, but people's advantage will be able to be considered. Is that really where we're going with this? And that can be a really tough argument, a tough pill to swallow. So Susan, take it wherever you want to go, but I just wanted to hit on some of the key findings. There's so much, it's like almost a 15-page abstract. Where do you want to go with it?
Well, and it is this series of articles by James Murphy. They're really well written. They're academic without being overwhelming. And you know, they also he gets to making very, very clear-cut, dramatic recommendations. And the recommendations actually in this article are very similar to the ones in the early decision article.
They really are.
Yeah, the disaggregated data and holding colleges more accountable for transparency. And
and the other big one was linking the money. He constantly had things, if you're going to get money, then you need to stop this practice.
That's right, from the federal government.
Federal,
right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. You know, having been both in admissions and on the high school side, Mark, it's just so not black and white for me at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's not.
We have the same view.
Yeah, it's not as polarized an issue, although on one hand, I feel like I'm going to be ready to lay down any shred of pro-legacy admission that I have if the Supreme Court strikes down affirmative action. I think Ketanji Brown Jackson is just right. You know, but then I say to myself, well, really, athletic recruitment is basically affirmative action, but it's talent-based, right?
Sure.
But is that okay?
I think talent-based people see as different.
Yes.
Versus just inherent privilege.
That's right. That's right.
But I feel very much the same way. I'm really torn. So we did an article. We've been talking about legacy admission at least once a year, going back for years. We did a segment on Johns Hopkins, the president, and he wrote that big article in the Atlantic about why they overturned affirmative action. It was probably 3 years ago. Dave and I did that. And that was some of the most compelling evidence for overturning it, because he shared how drastically different Johns Hopkins student body is without it. And what really forces you to think about there's limited spots. So you may theoretically be in favor of it, but that in effect means who you're shutting out. So he presented compelling data when he just looked at, let's just look at who our school is now that we've moved away from it. I thought that was compelling. But I've also been influenced by Anika, my original co-host, who works in the alumni office at North Carolina A&T. And North Carolina A&T is one of the most robust co-op programs in the country. And what do? They tag their alum to start bringing in right away with, I almost said ninth graders, but freshmen. I can think of a student I had at North Carolina A&T, and I was talking to his dad, very accomplished professional. He was so impressed with the fact that his son was at A&T for 7 weeks, and he already had a co-op opportunity that summer at General Motors. And so I've moved to more of a nuanced view that just because you're in a legacy, you're not entitled to special privileges. However, if you have a demonstrated track record of significant contribution, then I'm okay with it, understanding that that's how it helps advantages, and that's how it helps institutions. Now,
you mean if the parent has a track record of engagement?
Yes, if the parent has a track record of significant, and I don't define it just as big gifts,
right?
It could be the person that's been the alumni interview for
volunteering, and
it could be the chair of the committee that rallies because I do think that there are benefits to institutions to have some of that, and that's why some schools are so reluctant to give it up, right? And I think that a legitimate case can be made for that. And I think of a reason I used Anika is that's an example. Like, you've been consistently using your company to bring students in and host them. I mean, I look at it the same way I look at development, kind of like, okay, in one sense, in a complete individualistic sense, is it fair that little Johnny got a spot because dad gave $25 million toward the new science center? Or I'll even make it clear, toward a scholarship.
Right.
Well, you could say, well, that's not fair. Little Johnny's not as good a student as little James. But then you could say, well, how many more students are going to be able to now attend?
Right.
And I see it that way. So that's why I don't have a problem with that. Like you could say development admit is wrong. Like, you just go pure meritocracy. But that feels to me very myopic. Like, if somebody's contributions elevates your institution overall, I don't have a problem with that being factored in. So anyway, I asked you to speak, and then I jumped in and stole all your juice.
That's quite okay. Well, the thing we know about alumni children is that they are more likely to enroll.
Yeah.
They are less likely to need financial aid.
Mm-hmm.
They are more likely to donate more themselves, let alone the parent or grandparent. And they are more likely to be white. So that, in a way, that James Murphy's unpacking that for me was really helpful. I mean, I have had an enormous soft spot for alumni children all of my career, beginning early on in my admissions career.
Mm-hmm.
It just warmed my heart when alumni brought their kids to see the college, and they were proud to think that their son or daughter would want to continue that family legacy. And these were, not just affluent people. Some of them were, working class people, and they loved their college, and they wanted their child to have the same wonderful experience that they had, whether or not they were, a Fortune 500 CEO or, a small business owner or a librarian or whatever. And the institutions feel that way. They're there's the dollar prospective donor piece, but there's also that loyalty, engendering generational loyalty. However, who doesn't have that? Who's excluded from that model, from both the longevity of a relationship with an institution and also generational wealth? And it does go counter to a lot of our diversity and inclusion. I mean, that's what Johns Hopkins said is,
Sure.
But the interesting thing is, the Johns Hopkins of the world weren't founded for reasons of social upward mobility, right? That really, a lot of institutions in this country, private ones especially, that wasn't in their founding wherewithal, right? It's a fairly new, probably a post-World War II trend.
But I feel it's an epiphany, though. Like right now, pretty much every school, certainly anyone doing holistic admissions,
is feeling
of
that
the
way.
belief that the more you can assemble different people from all walks of life around the table, in the dining room, in the dorms.
That's right.
That's how you challenge people's thinking, expose people to new ideas. That's why you and I know that race-based affirmative action may go down in the courts, but schools will do everything in their power.
Yes, they will.
To do what they can within the law, because you're challenging their concept at the core of what they believe is the best education. And the more it's homogenous, the less they feel they're offering value, and they just believe it. And so they're going to fight for it. I want to say one thing. Even then, I have this more nuanced view. If I was playing devil's advocate with myself, that would lean me more to the Hopkins view. It would be, well, that sounds all good in theory, Stuck. You're talking about if you're connected or you've made a big contribution. I once read, Susan, that Harvard has 15,000 alumni interviewers all around the world.
Seems like a lot.
Well, they've cut it back a bit now, but before Zoom, they tried to have everybody in every country somewhere they could to try to have as close as they could as 100% of the people get an interview. Now in the Zoom world, you don't have to.
Right, it's not as big a deal.
Sure. Yeah, before you have to have you don't just have to have Colorado, you have to have people throughout the whole state. So you can't expect kids to drive too far. You can't expect your interviewers to drive too far. But when you take these schools with big alumni bases and small enrollments, even under my definition of are you a contributor, you can really lock up a lot of spots.
Yeah.
And exclude them from being able to be eligible to other people. And I think that's the most compelling argument against what I would still say is my current position.
I think you're absolutely right there. And I think the whole alumni interview perception, and all those years that you and I were at the same school, I knew that alumni generally felt that they were more important and more influential than they were. And that the alumni interview program existed as much to cultivate the alumni and to promote that sense of attachment and loyalty to profit the university financially. That everybody kind of knew that. And
sure, a way to keep them engaged.
Yeah.
To hopefully help dollars or
that's right.
service or something, but it was
school. You remember there was a parent at our school, a woman who had a couple of daughters at our school, and she had been a D1 athlete in an Ivy, brilliant woman. She was a CEO of a big company, really incredible person, and a wonderful person too, as were her daughters. And she came into my office one day and she said, well, here I am with a junior. My oldest child now is a junior, rising to be a senior. And the advancement office of my alma mater pays a call on me. She said, I was really ready to eat this person alive because of the timing.
Mm-hmm.
She took no prisoners. It was her style anyway. And
Sure.
I said, well, tell me about that. And she goes, well, I had lunch with them. And
Yeah.
I looked at him and I said, so what's it going to take?
Mm-hmm.
And I just loved this conversation. So she just knocked this advancement officer off his socks. And she said, tell me what's it going to take? And he kind of stammered and fussed. And, she had been not just a graduate of the school. She had been an alumni interviewer. She had been a career resource network person, all sorts of things. And he said, let me tell you, it takes a building.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but she started laughing really hard. And she said, well, thanks for your honesty.
Yeah.
Thanks for your honesty. So even, and this was probably 15 years ago.
I'm in 50. It's my year going into year 15 here, Susan. So at least
there you go. Yeah. There you go. And so, that started turning my head a little bit. And
you mean to how few spots development actually gets, or how much you have to actually give? Or
well,
what?
I think a lot of parents feel, well, I'm going to maybe start donating and get active in my alumni group when my kids go to high school.
Yeah.
And that I think the fact that they are a graduate of a school is still respected by the institution. There's always
a lot of times they'll get a third read in schools, a different read they may get.
Unless it's been outlawed, of course.
Correct.
But
correct.
There's always, again, all things being equal among applicants, right? There's going to be that leaning toward that student who's more likely to yield, and they're more likely to really understand the heartbeat of the university. They're picking it perhaps for the right reasons. It's not so random, right? As that random applicant from, afar or whatever, that they get the esprit, they've been on campus.
All things are very valuable to school.
Yeah. But the alum who suddenly decides to get active in hopes that will then be an influence is probably wrong.
I'll say this. We have a listener to our podcast, and I'll just say that.
Yeah.
That communicates regularly with us and, wrote in, just having some dialogue and some conversation around this, because her and her husband both have legacy at one of the most exclusive schools in the country, and they were fortunate enough their child was able to be admitted. But one thing that this listener shared was that I think a lot of people make a mistake of thinking that you can get involved in when your kid is in high school.
Oh.
This is someone that's been doing a lot of things for over a decade. And of course, their kid was extremely strong. You don't get in any of these schools unless your kid is extremely strong. Like we often say, for all aspects of if we want to say affirmative action in the broadest sense, where schools take affirmative actions, we're only talking about amongst qualified people.
Yes.
We're not talking about someone going from unqualified to qualified. But I thought that was a pretty astute observation, and she was reflecting on what she saw a lot of her peers doing. Oh, my kid's in ninth grade, and I think the point you bring up too. Maybe I need to give $1,000 or $5,000. One of the people in my network works with a lot of really high net worth individuals, and at a lot of the most selective schools in the country. And she will frequently say when we talk, when they start having this conversation with me, I tell them it starts at 8 figures.
Yes, I've quoted you on that.
Yeah. Well, that comes from me quoting her. And it's also a former admission officer at one of the most prestigious schools in the country as well.
Wow.
So she's both a counselor, and she's been on the other side of, I'm not going to, mention the school, but it's one of the sizzle wow names out there. A very, very, very short list.
Wow. Well, I something that stuck out to me in Julia's comments in the earlier episode was that in her, and she's at a school that, as she said, has the legacy issue there is so incredibly significant because of their location. And, they have umpteen faculty, staff, children. As we did at Westham, we had a fair number of Penn faculty and staff kids. So I kind of knew what was going on there. But Julia is like on steroids compared to that. And that she said in her experience, there had only ever been one student who she felt was not a contender in his or her own right without the legacy status. Now, we know that there are some big name universities that have those kids applying, and they kind of broker a deal with the family so that the student has a door into the university, but not right then, not right there, because basically the university doesn't want the public seeing the favoritism, right?
So are you talking about, just so our listeners know, like your spring admit or go somewhere and come in a year? Or are you talking about all of those different strategies?
Well, and some just require a gap year.
Yeah.
The famous Z list, which it's referred to at some schools, where and in some cases the students are told they may not study elsewhere. They are simply to go and grow up and work. These aren't students who are unprepared. They just were not competitive. But an institution is never going to admit a unprepared student because of the risk of failure and the family then really having a problem. In fact, I'll tell you a very short, funny story at Bates. There was one instance in my 12 years there where we admitted a completely unqualified student. And the parent was a famous state politician who became a national politician, who was a trustee of an alumnus of the institution, and a beloved person. And he said to the dean of admissions, I don't think she should come now. Maybe she should come later, but we would really appreciate it if you didn't reject her. This was a long time ago. He said, we're going to have to live together for a long time as a family. So, of course, the president and the dean admitted the student. The student did not enroll, and she never did. But it kept the peace with a very, very important family that was important for a lot of historical reasons. But I just say that as an example of, but then I also watched celebrities come through the admission process, other politicians, other people with social cachet, where colleges like to have their fair share of those people. Maybe not so much now after Varsity Blues, right?
Well, I still think they do. That's obviously negative publicity. But if you're a celebrity, let's say you're a famous actor,
right,
or actress, it's a lot of publicity that schools get.
Absolutely.
From that,
Absolutely. And they're not necessarily legacies; they just are VIPs.
Correct.
So I wouldn't want our parents, our listeners, to think that legacy is kind of the only preferential category. I mean, there are dozens.
No, I think we've talked about that. Just even in the context of all the different hooks, there's so many different things that can really fit under that bucket. I have two questions for you. One is, do you think let's assume that, unfortunately, that we're right and affirmative action is either completely abrogated or substantially curtailed? Do you think all of a sudden that the attention goes to legacy in a very acute way, similar to what's happened on a state by state basis? It's been very clear that one is kind of gone with the other. Because I see that, like Colorado passed legislation. I could even see other states passing legislation. At least that's on the public side. The private side, of course, is where a lot of the battle is fought. So that's my first question. And then my second question is, Like critique my view. What are your thoughts of, I'm not opposed to it, but I need significant evidence that you're kind of a bigwig within the alumni pool, not necessarily from a standpoint of wealth, but you're making a big splash as far as your contributions to our institution. Like, what is your critique on that?
I think it's going to go all or nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think the subjective lens, Mark, that you're talking about there, it's already in place, you know, with these dollar expectations.
Sure.
And I think that having a differential legacy policy would further discriminate against populations of even alumni, you know,
Sure.
where we now are seeing, you know, the parents who benefited from affirmative action and were able to then enter the applicant pools and enroll at schools that historically had not had space for them or funding for them. You know, we want this to become generational, but what if they're not in a position, you know, they're two teachers or a nurse and a, you know, whatever, physical therapist, or, you know, people who go into the service professions. You know, I think of our school that was a Quaker school and how many parents went into humanitarian occupations and would never be in a position to necessarily donate a lot of money, but they, you know, what would happen to a lot of the people who were doing good in the world, but might not have had the inclination to spend all of their time volunteering for their institution. Now, I don't know. I agree with you in part that I think it's already being done that way. I don't think alumni get the same weight for their children just from having a diploma. I think they're always
it's not necessarily brand new.
Right. But we don't want this to become more aristocratic than it is. And I think that's where we're going to take down this kind of what's called the birthright advantage.
I think you're probably right. And when you say the all or nothing, I think there's going to be tremendous pressure on institutions to move away from legacy and I think it's going to happen fast.
I agree.
In the same way we saw test optional spread fast, in the same way we are seeing schools that are saying we're not participating with the law school, U.S. News rankings, and the med school, that happened really fast.
Sure did.
And I think, you know, another thing I remember happened really fast. Colby College was the first one to do it, where they started allowing people to self-report scores rather than have to send them through the College Board, you know, for your test scores back in 2015, 16. And then before long, that list was 100 plus. So stuff can, of course, that just made natural sense. That was one of those, why are we why are we making people pay when we can ask for official scores only for those who are enrolled? Like, that was a kind of a no-brainer one. But the point is, we've seen these things that can happen and they can spread really, really fast. And then it can get to the point where any school that wants to be known for its access, you are really on the defensive if all your overlaps are doing something that you're not.
That's right.
That's when stuff can really, you know, because then people start asking, like, you know, stakeholders start, why are we doing this when so-and-so's not? And I think that's the interesting thing with legacy, though, is that, boy, there's so much power wrapped up in that.
That's right.
So you're really talking about going after the power structure in a way where you're not necessarily when you talk about race-based affirmative action. And that's what's going to be really, it's just going to be fascinating, because there are definitely private schools that really would be very upset to not have to continue some form of legacy. And of course, there's all those semantics of it goes, but then it goes in name, and then, you know what I mean? There's still going to be some of that for decades, I'm sure.
Well, you know, and I've thought a little bit about that. How would that happen? So the question of, you know, where did your parents go to college has been taken off the Common App. That was a year, not very long ago, just a couple, maybe 2 years ago. So the colleges had to move it to their supplements. Right. So if the university I read for this year, the question on the supplement was, did anyone in your family go to this college? It was
Sure.
as simple as that, right?
Yeah.
And, legacies sometimes are defined just as parents, but colleges want to know, siblings, grandparents, what's the longevity.
Grad school versus undergrad.
But is this something I noticed this year, a couple of letters that had been added to students' files from either family, friends, or from relatives, people in the family, that detailed the extent of the legacy connection. So how's that going to work out? So a family could self-disclose, right? They could come to campus, have an interview. The interview report is blah, 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 or it's self-disclosed in the application. Is the college going to be obligated to, I'd have to ask like Johns Hopkins and some of the places now, so they're just not influenced. They can't inflate the rating on that basis.
I think it's going to get ugly because I could see alumni connected doing boycott. Let's not give any money if they do this. That's gonna. Boy, that sure gets people's attention. If some high rollers say let's not donate anymore unless this. I mean, it's gonna really get interesting. Susan, I would love to keep going, but I kind of have a rule that once we hit an hour, is the witching hour.
You bet.
We stop even if it's mid-sentence, knowing that we have another shot to come back and get another bite of the apple and continue these topics. But this has been fantastic as always, and I can't wait to talk to you next month. We'll look up James' last one.
That's right.
He did in the trilogy on transparency. So
we'll
talk about that next month.
Terrific,
see you then.
Mark. You bet.
Yeah,
bye-bye.
Thanks. Yeah, bye.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Friends, hopefully you've heard parts 1 and 2 where Lisa and I have been discussing a number of different groups of people who often feel disillusioned with how the college process ends up working for them. And we're going to continue that today with groups 3 and 4 and hopefully offer you some encouragement so that you are not disillusioned with the college process. Yeah, there are a lot of potential benefits if people have the resources for it. You don't have to do it. I don't want to make people feel like you got to do this thing over here. But, there's benefits to public, benefits to private. Each family's got their own values. But yeah, there certainly are benefits. And kids, when they get to places, generally do feel very well prepared.
Right.
And maybe the benefit is you're a rising tide lifts all boats. And so you're inspired where Sonia could have coasted, at her other school and gotten an A,
right.
And now she's forced to have the best brought out of her. So she reaches her highest potential. And so she ultimately fulfills it. And so there's a lot, or also you're not distracted in class because they can they've pre-screened that on the front end.
Right,
and if you don't get your act together, you have to leave. Yeah, the behavior stuff. Smaller classes, less behavior issues. So you get, so there's benefits, but on the college process, it's not normally what people think.
No.
It's just not.
No.
And the college lists, it's really deceiving, to be honest, because most of the times, if you look at the people that are getting in those spots, they're hooked. And if you're not hooked, you really wouldn't have had a shot at that spot.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, I remember I could keep you up with stories all day, but I used to recruit from the school on the Upper East Side of New York, which is very wealthy.
Right.
And the families there used to have a conversation with how big of a gift do I have to give for my kid? Do I talk to them or do you talk to them? Like, there's a whole world that happens that people don't even know how people get into these places.
Yeah.
Then there's another thing, which, we haven't talked about, which is celebrities.
Oh,
yeah. So celebrities.
Are you an Obama? No, sorry.
I mean, places like Dartmouth have literally separate tours just for celebrities. Because think about it. You don't want, you're on a tour. It's like, that's Tom Cruise. That's Tom Cruise.
Well, that Tom Cruise is a little old to go to college, Mark.
I meant his kid taking
Sir
taking his
Cruise,
kid
maybe.
around. I meant
Yes,
Tom
yeah.
Cruise taking your kid around. You know, like it's kind of distracting. So they have but the point I'm making is that's a whole other thing. So a college looks at it as like, you know what? We're gonna get some really good publicity if Tom Cruise's kids are here.
Right.
So there's a lot of ways that kids get in these places that average people, they don't really have put it this way. So many of those spots evaporate when you start saying, oh, there's the celebrity. Oh, there's the development. Oh, there's the athlete. Oh, there's all the internationals.
Yeah.
And all the different unique types of diversity, and then the undersubscribed majors. And then you really, really boil down as like, oh. And so, but when you're a private school, you think I paid all this. And then also the thing about the private schools is they're the ones that apply in mass to these places.
Yeah. Right.
I mean, Julia said it on the podcast before, is that there's 185 in her graduating class. Some schools have more than 100. Some Ivies get over 100 apps from her school out of that 185.
Yeah.
So if you're sitting there and you have 105 apps from one school, you can be really picky.
Yeah. True.
Because, that's just one school and you got all these other schools to go to. So what I want to try to inject some positivism into this. I mean, I'm trying to help people, but what can people take? I guess we were trying to do it when we were talking about think about the benefits other than the college admission side. I guess that's a biggest one, right?
Well, yeah, if your kids, I mean, the Evan Mandry book, I don't know if you've read that, but he addresses a lot of
I skimmed it.
Stuff. Oh my God. I hope we get to have him on the podcast soon because I think
he's already committed to come on.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll have you do that interview, Lisa.
I would love to do that, or at least sit in on it because I think he's so interesting and I love his perspective. But, there's just so many things that come from hanging around with, people who either have hooks or money or celebrities. And you do get exposure to that in a private school setting that you might not get at your local public university. That's a benefit. I mean, there are all kinds of benefits, even that are not educational.
And I'll tell you another benefit is if you just come down just from the most selective, it's a huge benefit right now being a tuition paying family.
Right. And if you're full pay,
yes, it's a huge benefit. Do you know how many people get in because they're full pay that wouldn't get in because they're not full pay? The problem is when you get to the Browns, and the Dukes and that level, there's tons of them, right? But it's just, you go just down a little bit, not quite at that sort of that echelon. I mean, schools don't talk about this as much as it really is, because why would you? That'd be so discouraging to be talking to students and saying, well, we're going to, we're kind of looking at, who can pay. That's a factor. We got bills to pay over here. That's just not for public consumption. You might have to say we're need aware, throw it out there. It is huge. So that's a big, big, big benefit. It just you just can't buy your way in unless you get a really, really large gift. Most people don't have the 8-figure type gifts.
No, most people.
The little $1,000, for an alum on your anniversary or the donor request isn't cutting it.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's it on private schools. Honestly, go to a private school because of the caliber of the education you'll get. Or the values that you feel are bequeathed there and how they'll impact your kid, and some of that could be, not having some adverse influences around you. Of course, you have to be careful of some other knuckleheads, but, those are the reasons. And don't think, be very careful not to look at a college list.
Right.
And think
just
that's
that
you.
Away. Yeah. Just throw it away.
Yeah, because there's just usually those high-powered kids, you were not in that situation. They were hooked normally, and you may be hooked too. And use your hooks if by all means, if you have them. I'm not saying it's stupid. And understand, not all hooks are equal.
I mean, I have a friend, and she just texted me yesterday because her son was going through the prep school application process. He's a really fabulous hockey player, incredibly talented, and he's gifted intellectually. So he got into Exeter and Choate, which is amazing.
Sure.
But like if he plays hockey at those schools, like he would probably, maybe be a hockey recruit at some of these, other
Yep.
schools and the next round.
Exactly. And people will look and they can look at Exeter and say, oh, he's at Harvard, and then they don't know. They just see Harvard, but he was hockey. Without hockey, probably wouldn't happen.
Right. And I think he's a great kid, but I don't know if without hockey, Exeter and
But
Choate
very
would have
few
happened.
kids get in these places without hooks. So it's not a knock on
Right.
him.
Mhm.
Like most of the time you get in because you had something. If it wasn't alumni, it was something. So that's just the reality. So let's go to the last one, which this is the hardest one to talk about, but we pride ourselves on keeping it real. So this is going to be one of the keep it real conversations. So if you are Caucasian or Asian, and especially if you come from a highly represented state, I'm talking about like places like Northern Virginia to, up through Massachusetts, or it could be other, highly populated places too, like, certain suburbs of Chicago, it's not, those aren't the only places. And other places in California, I'm not saying those are the only places. It's just going to be tough because of supply and demand.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's difficult for people is a couple of things are difficult. One, we're just so raised in this individual meritocracy mentality. And people don't realize that's not how college admissions thinks. They think of it as a team. And it's so like, who is bringing what we don't have to strengthen our team? That's why you hear me use the orchestra example and the football team example all the time. I already have 9 quarterbacks. I need a blocker, need a safety. And because those are overrepresented groups, that's where I see the most disillusionment.
Right. Well,
is within
particularly
that
if you're a
group.
girl.
And I was going to say that too. You beat me to that.
If you identify as female, like
I was going to say
you're
that too.
a
You
dime
beat
a
me to
dozen
it.
because there are so many high achieving, fabulous ladies out there,
Yeah.
killing it, that all competing against each other, and there are more women applying for college that are highly
Correct.
qualified than men.
Yeah.
So that depresses me quite a bit. I got to be honest.
I know. And it's understandable, but you'd think, it's the reality, and it's something people have to be aware of, because this is where I see a lot of the, the unfulfilled expectations. I expected this and it just did not happen for me. And you beat me to it. I was going to throw the gender layer in there as well. And that's really important because it's most pronounced there. Especially with Caucasian families. I see it with Asian families. I see it with male and female.
Right.
A lot.
Right.
But with Caucasian families, there seems to be a bigger gap between the men and the women. And so I see it there. Now, some of that is also some middle class entitlement, because percentage wise, as rough as it is for that group, if you remove the social class piece, more people are getting in that group than they're getting in out of the south side of Chicago, where they have to overcome all those. But people don't.
It's just like the individual sense of things versus the whole picture, right?
Well, yeah. Well, people will combine that with all the other things, right? They'll say, yeah, but I had the 1570 and I was the valedictorian. That kid did it. So so the thing about these things is that there's a confluence of factors, right? So like literally some people have all 4 of these boxes. Like I was an alum, and I went to a private school, and I had those high numbers, whether it's the testing or the class rank or the GPA or the 8.5s on my APs, whatever, right? And then I'm also like a white female from New Jersey, which is so many people in New Jersey want to leave New Jersey. So it's a tough area. But, it's not only that. I just picked one state. I could have said New York. New York's tough. I could have said Boston. I could have said, many other places. Northern Virginia, Palo Alto, California. Some people literally have all four of them combined in one. And that's where I see the most disillusionment. So I know it's tough because we've talked before just on the gender side, Lisa, of how you've we fought so hard, and then you go out into a man's world where men get the advantages with promotion, and so we're disadvantaged on the college admission side, and then we're disadvantaged in the corporate world again.
Yeah, and I just read a study in, I think, the Washington Post. Women are still earning 92 cents to every dollar that a man makes, and it's kind of their ability to get promoted, is diminished if they have children.
Sure.
Because, obviously have to take time to recover from childbirth and, petty little problems like that, right? Continue the species. It's just I feel and I know I feel it's on the one hand, I look at my life and I say, I'm so incredibly privileged.
Mm-hmm.
I have all the things. I don't have to worry about starving. Generally, no one's shooting at me in my neighborhood. My kids go to a fabulous school.
Right.
But then on the other hand, it's but that boy over there, he's got even more things, and it's hard to kind of keep it in perspective all the time. And it wrangles a little bit, but what can you do?
The only thing I'll say about gender, I don't feel it's about gender to intentionally be discriminatory. It's really about the needs of the institution, supply demand, because
they need more boys.
Correct. It's the same thing as Linda tells the story of how when she was traveling around, with Joel, her husband, and they were visiting colleges, and they found out, she had a daughter, and we know Linda's daughter was top notch.
Yes.
Top of her class. Literally, she said some of them, they would almost be panting, we got a live one in here, because she was engineering at comp sci. In other words, you know what I mean? Because of the gender imbalance,
right? She
was being heavily recruited. So it's more about that, right? So yeah, it's gonna help a guy even more in elementary education or fashion design or nursing, and it's gonna work. It can work to the benefit of a woman for certain professions. So to me, it's more about the needs of the institution than it's about we're intentionally going to be
I don't think anyone's
discriminatory by gender.
Yeah, let's put those women back in their place or anything like that.
Right.
I just think it's just that the availability of for whatever reason, and we've talked about this before, and it still seems somewhat mysterious to me, but the availability of high achieving boys isn't as great as the availability of high achieving girls right now. And so that's a hook, right? In a way, in certain schools.
Yeah, boys can get away with, especially, and I saw this working in a boarding school, boys can get away a little more with having slower starts to high school.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And having more lackluster ninth grades, and sometimes even 10th, fall of 10th. And it's seen as a development delay, their boys are 2 years behind in maturity. It'll kick in for them. Where with girls, it's I'm not saying you can't have some hiccups. Nobody's perfect, but there's just not as many of them. So this is where I see the most frustration is, and it's pretty significant. White females. And I can't just say Asian, by the way. It's more,
right.
It's overrepresented Asian countries on the college campus. Because schools that are really doing holistic admissions, they'll differentiate between the Vietnamese student that they don't see that many from, and many other Asian countries where they have a dearth of applicants. A few of the underrepresented Asians where being Asian can even be a hook are Hmong, Vietnamese, Laotian, and Cambodian, and in some instances, even Filipino. test scores for Cambodians and other metrics are very similar to Black Americans. So I don't want to perpetuate the model majority myth, which most Asians will tell you is a bunch of malarkey. So those are ones that are really truly doing holistic admissions. They don't just paint everybody in the same bucket.
Right, exactly.
But places like India and China, Korea, those tend to be overrepresented.
Right.
And that's just how they look at it. They look at it from that prism of what do we not like. At the core, these schools believe that what makes for the best education is bringing together very talented people of high character who are very, very different, so that you can have this learning laboratory where we can learn from each other. And so that's some social engineering. Holistic admissions is social engineering.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, and so that, and that's kind of how it is. Obviously, some schools have restrictions. Some states have restrictions on what they can do with regard to some of that. But how can we end on a positive and not feel like people just feel like, I'm depressed?
You know what? It's not you.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, like the Evan Mandry book, Poison Ivy, is like, in a way, it's depressing because you're like, oh God, I'm never going to move up. I can't. I don't have the juice. On the other hand, it's like, well, I guess I don't have to worry and try at that and feel bad about myself that it's not going to happen. It's if the system is sort of set up in a certain way that you're not probably going to be able to do something, you will put your energy into what you can do. And go that way and try to let go of all that status and, that type of thinking, because it will not serve you. It only probably is going to hurt you. And it's better just to, it makes you look at what can I do? Where can I go? How can I have a meaningful career, life, whatever it is that your goal is, and just to focus on that.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to say that there's not things that people can do it's just futile, it's just despair. There's not things you can do to strengthen your candidacy. There's a lot you can do to strengthen your candidacy and increase your chances overall at schools. So I'm not trying to say it's just futile. So just, it is what it is. But the biggest, honestly do believe the single best advice I can give to somebody in the situation, the four categories we're talking about, is to get off this fixation with such a small list.
Right.
So if you accept there's 2,400 4-year accredited schools out there, nonprofit, degree granting, federal funding receiving schools, do you think that maybe 4% of them are good? Okay.
Right, exactly.
5% or 5% of the schools, 1 out of 20 good? Well, that gives you 125 schools,
Right.
instead of 25. And that's the single biggest thing I would say. If you can move your mind to that mind, or 10% are good, okay, you pick your number, but don't tell me only 1% of the schools are good.
Right. Well, it's ridiculous,
Yeah. And if you can have that mind shift, you will be so liberated. I mean, Lisa, you and I see it. Like the people that go through this process, and I'm talking about the people that are in those 4 buckets and they're really high achieving, but they accept the fact that there's 150 really good schools or whatever instead of 25. They have so much success and so much less stress.
Yeah, they feel like they accomplished something and feel good about themselves. And I think it's a life lesson.
A lot of times they end up paying a lot less for college because of the merit money they get thrown at them.
Nice merit aid.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, I think it's a life lesson, right? To not just look at what the marketing says, what the social pressure says, but to look at what is actually good for me. What is actually going to be a good fit for me, and where am I going to be a good fit for them? And, where it's going to be a mutually beneficial situation. That's where the magic happens, right? You're happy to be there. They're happy to have you there. You're working together to, get your education done in a really positive way. So.
And that's it. I just really hope, listeners, that you will take that challenge on and to expand your version of what you regard as a good school. If you will take that away from this, your kids will have such a better process.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And you know what? You're going to find out these schools are amazing. I remember when I had on, what's his name? He started the UC programs, Antonov, Stephen Antonov.
Oh, Stephen Antonov? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, tell you the truth, I can't remember if this was when he was on Your Cloud's My Kid or if it was just me talking to him off air. But I can say what he said because he wouldn't mind me saying it. I was like, you've been doing this now for like 40 plus years. What's the biggest lesson you've learned? He's like, I used to think there was this short list of like truly first choice options, And the more I realized like how amazing these schools are, like there's like 150 schools like that are like first choice options. And I used to think that number was like, like maybe like the Ivies and another 15 or something, And so the point is, this is not like some positive psychology, get yourself in this positive state of mind to avoid disappointment. No, like there's incredible treasures at these other places that if you will be open-minded enough to accept it, you're going to love what you're going to discover about their programs.
Right. Right.
And I would argue there's more than 150 when you look at like schools that have an incredible program maybe in your area of interest.
Well, that's exactly right. Like, so if you look at all the different niches,
correct,
you're going to find some, and any niche, like you're going to find some amazing schools that, you'd be very competitive to get in at and might get a lot of merit money and, have a really successful college career. So,
and career beyond college, like, you know what I mean?
Yes.
Set up for, yeah. So I know we took a long time on this, but hopefully people found it helpful and enjoyable.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, hopefully you heard part one, where I'm interviewing Andre Phillips, the director of admissions at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We'll now resume with part two, and we're talking about understanding UW-Madison. Let's talk about your strongest programs. And I want you to kind of approach it two ways. I'd love you to share your strongest programs sort of reputationally, historically. And then I'd also like you to share programs that you on the inside, are maybe every bit as strong as the ones you're most known for, but they fly under the radar. Sure. And I want to ask that question because a lot of times when families will listen and they'll respond, they'll literally visit colleges based on, what people like you say. And a lot of times they think in terms of majors. My kid wants to do X. Who's good at X? So I'd love to just have your thoughts on both the historically sort of reputational powerhouses and the hidden gems.
Sure. Well, let me first say at the outset, at the risk of...
I know what you're going to say. Everything's strong. I know.
No,
I know that speech.
I wasn't about to say that, but thank you for that. Yes, every program is strong. But seriously, what I was going to say, at the risk of upsetting one of our 8 undergraduate deans, all of whom are tremendous.
Not trying to put you in the doghouse.
No, I think that in total, the area of discussion, the questions you've asked, are really important, not so much about our institution, but how to really get at what am I trying to learn about where my son or my daughter might ultimately end up. And I'll say this first and then really dig into this because I think this is a good set of questions. Number one, the learning process is not settled in the first, second, or maybe even third year of undergraduate. And so in thinking about how do we plan for what are the important benchmarks or steps along the way? Because just as classes and courses increase in rigor and challenge over time, so too does the evolution of a student's learning journey, if I can use that over-route phrase for a moment. And so what I would say then in addressing UW-Madison, the best way to approach how might I tackle a place that offers 130 majors, 70 concentrations or minors, 8 schools and colleges, all of whom offer adjacent learning up? That's a lot to take on. So what I would say, first and foremost, understand structure. And I'm going to use 2 examples that on the surface will look radically different, but are really informed by a similar mission. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, I spent a number of years at the University of Chicago.
Like 26, I think, wasn't it?
27 years
27,
at the University,
yeah.
27 years at the University of Chicago. We would hang our hat on our core curriculum, in some ways not unlike our good friends in New York, Columbia University in the city of New York. A core curriculum which is foundational to everything else students would do. And if students approach the core correctly with the same degree of energy and interest, foundationally, the belief then is they could go off and do any number of things. And oftentimes students would walk in the door believing one thing and they would end up in some other space. The launching pad of the core curriculum did that for them at Chicago, I imagine in similar ways at Columbia University in the city of New York. So why do I start there? I start there to say, folks don't always recognize that the University of Wisconsin-Madison has foundational education in a similar way. And for students to really get off to an extraordinarily good start is to understand the importance and the reasons behind foundational education, also in my mind known as the core. And so we have an expectation that all students are going to do some math, they do some language, they're going to do some quantitative analysis to build a foundation that prepares them for any number of disciplines that they either want to pursue from the moment they walk in the door or they discover during their tenure here. And so something I said a moment ago is really important then. Students don't really have to know, unless they're thinking about business, engineering, and nursing, and I'll get to that in a moment, they don't have to know what they're going to major in. They really ought to have some idea what brings them pleasure and joy, and maybe they would want to do in their professional lives after they're done with their formal education. And that too will hold true for engineering and business and nursing. But what I really think is most important is that students know how to approach our foundational coursework, which could take up to a fourth or maybe more of their educational experience. And so getting off to a really good start. So why do I mention business, engineering, and nursing? For business and engineering, students have to declare at the point of application their preferred desire to pursue a program within those schools. They prefer to be a mechanical engineer or a nuclear engineer or any of the 12 programs. In business, they prefer finance or real estate or accounting or any of the 10 programs there. So in those cases, students need to have then really pursued an understanding of what will a nuclear engineer actually do, or what will an MEE student actually do, or pick your program. And so what am I talking about? I'm talking about advanced research beyond, man, that sounds really cool. And if I go get a business degree, well, what do you want to major? I don't know, but I just wanted to be business is not the right answer, but some real research. Now, let me answer your first part of your question as a last notion. When students look at, okay, you're looking to build an enrolling class of 8,000 students. How many seats ought to be the question they should ask that are available in each of the 8 schools and colleges? And what you would quickly find, and I'm going to use some quick math here, engineering and business are not equal in the number of seats they make available to incoming first-year students. the College of Letters and Science, where over 60
Can you
million.
throw some real numbers out, Andre, just around about
Sure,
how many spots? I think that'll be helpful for our listeners.
yeah, absolutely. Let me return to that because I want to say this last thing about 10 programs in business, 12 in engineering, 60 in the College of Letters and Science. And so if you're doing your math, and it's not a math equation to determine admission, it's just to know what you face and why it's important to do your research. So you haven't heard me say a thing about the 60 programs other than they are housed within Letters and Science. And within Letters and Science, there are no limits, and I'm saying this and being generous, to the 60 programs. What our faculty and the dean of the College of Letters and Science is saying, we provide over 85% of all of the classes offered here to undergraduates. And so, again, if you're doing the math, you can start to understand the expanse of faculty-led coursework in one of the schools and colleges. So let's go back. If we're thinking about engineering, for example, the dean there says we are looking for an enrolling class of 1,200 students. If you look at business, they are saying to the Office of Admissions and Recruitment, my team and I, we're looking to you to admit on behalf of our program 650 students. They're also saying that leaves us room to admit about 300 students who are currently undergraduates in their first year. Now, let's tie all of these notions quickly.
Now, are you talking admit or enroll? Because those are different.
Enroll.
Right? Enroll. Okay. Yep.
Seats available.
Yep.
Right? So seats available. And why is all of this important? Last notion. It's really important because remember that little thing I said about discovery? And if you're thinking about business, there are some students who may apply and say, hey, I want business and I know what I want. And then we might say, just given the number of applications, you look good as an applicant to the university. Evidence suggests that all things being equal, you'll be fine. We just don't have enough room because actually we only have 650 seats. But you can come, start your first year, have some real in-person experiences. That's going to bolster your application. So when you apply spring of your first year, not only do you have everything you engaged in high school, you have the benefit of at least one term of being a collegiate at UW, and you might have a shot. You're still competing because this is a competition. It's just a different competition. And so those students have the grand benefit of all of the resources and opportunities of the direct admit student, plus they have the window to explore. And here's what we find as a last notion. Some of those students get here and say, I'm still interested in business, but I find this program over in the School of Human Ecology, personal finance. That's a plug, by the way. Personal finance is really what I'm interested in, and it's a smaller learning environment. And I've heard from the dean of the School of Human Ecology that they are thinking about creative ways to pursue preparation for engaging in business. That is far more appealing to me. And so I say all of that to say, if foundationally students are building breadth and depth as early as their first year, that sets them up for future success. And as a last notion, and yet another plug, but I need to say this, some of our most successful alums did not pursue business as a major. And I have the good fortune over time, I've met a handful of these incredibly well-educated, successful men and women who are alums of the university doing great things, and they never set foot in the school, in a classroom in the School of Business. But they took full advantage of the breadth of opportunities at the university to prepare them to be successful in their workaday world, in their careers. And so that too is a reminder that the sky won't fall if students don't have a business degree. from UW-Madison. That doesn't mean that they shouldn't pursue it, but they should know that they have opportunities. And again, I say this all the time. My peers and my friends at other places could likely say the same things I'm saying about preparing themselves for careers with great offerings across the expanse of the university they're at. That's certainly the case here at UW-Madison.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, our recommended resource for episode 315 is a podcast we've featured before called Future You. It's Jeffrey Salingo's podcast, where he looks at really kind of hot topics in the news, really issues in higher ed. But it's a specific episode. It's the March 28th episode, and it's called The Affirmative Action Conversation Colleges Should Be Having. So what Salingo does in this episode is he has an interview with the president of James Madison University. And this president played a key role as the lawyer back in the University of Michigan Supreme Court cases 20 years ago. And so he offers a real historical explanation on how he thinks the court's decision could impact far more than just higher ed admissions. It's a really, really good episode. Once again, it's called The Affirmative Action Conversation Colleges Should Be Having, and it's on the Future You podcast, and it's our recommended resource for episode 315. So let me see if I got it right. Recap what you said. There's 12 specialties for engineering, 10 for business, for 650 spots for incoming first years off of about 8,000 that you're going to take in. So those programs are quite competitive, and you're actually admitting by major for those programs, not for most of the programs at UW-Madison, but those programs. Nursing is being another one. You're admitting by major, but if you don't get in, you still may get into the school, and you still might get another bite of the apple because they're reserving quite a few spots for first years, or I guess second years that want to transfer in. You also said human ecology and personal finance are a couple really good programs that don't necessarily fall into one of those buckets. Was that a distillation?
That's great. You probably should have been answering the question you posed. But so two clarifications: 1,200 enrolling seats for the programs in engineering.
Yeah.
The School of Human Ecology offers an array of disciplines. Personal finance is just one of them. And I use that as an example that I think you captured correctly. It's a smaller school. They are working with significantly fewer numbers. But the fact of the matter, if you look at our business school in each enrolling class, I'd say compared to some of our peer institutions, that's a smaller cohort of students. And so it's good for us, and particularly good for students who have a bit of flexibility in mind, or they're not absolutely certain. Like, for example, if you know that you want to pursue real estate, that's you've got to be pretty certain about that. But if you're thinking about the arena of business, and there are lots of offerings, and again, that's why I think where the dean in the School of Human Ecology, also known here affectionately as SOHE. So the dean of the School of Human Ecology, I think, is really on to something. And I've listened to her speak about working with her colleagues nationally who are thinking about the grand expanse of opportunities, particularly for students that bring a bit of creativity to what they would like to do. For example, being entrepreneurs and what it means to be prepared to evolve in one's thinking over time. So it's for someone who spent a little bit of time in the business school 100 years ago. Myself, I find it extraordinarily exciting to think about how do you do the foundational education that I spoke about a bit earlier, and you scaffold in the creative learning space around areas you want to study.
Let me ask you about a couple of programs, Andre, that I often refer you guys for. Definitely business and engineering. We know those are powerhouse programs, and I appreciate you, delineating that. Foreign languages, you guys are pretty amazing. I think you're in the conversation for top in the country with what you offer, breadth and depth. Love you to talk about that. And a couple others that I think you're really strong on are history and poli-sci, because,
Yep.
You're right there at the capital. So anything you want to say about foreign languages, political science, or history?
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for raising it, Mark. I think sometimes when we think about in the educational space, what flies under the radar, and in some ways, I use bad language when not bad language, but
We get it.
I think what's missed is the power of where scholars spend their time and develop their craft. And in the languages, again, as we think about not only foundational education, which is powerful, but just where scholars are found, it's in the breadth of languages here and what we do that stands adjacent to the in-class experience. The fact that we offer opportunities for students to immerse themselves in the language and culture, and those go hand in hand. And as I like to think about it, is really three areas: language, being immersed in understanding culture, but also understanding history. And that language and words and names, all of those things fit and matter. And our scholars think about these things intentionally, and we're extraordinarily good at it. So for students who are thinking about, or maybe even themselves have grown up in or near culturally diverse experiences, and are intrigued by being able to converse in a different language or to understand a culture and its history and its evolution, to understand not only its history, but the politics that maybe have shaped a region of the world that they are somehow connected to or curious about. Our scholars here, our faculty here, are extraordinarily good, and the offerings and the breadth are really good. So I would say for students who are not thinking about, and maybe they're thinking about business, but not thinking about it in the very classic way that most folks do, language, history, and culture fitting together is an excellent and exciting way to educate oneself as an undergraduate. And we do some very good things in that arena.
Let's talk admissions process. So we all know the transcript's the most important part of the evaluation. Transcripts lets you see the rigor, it lets you see grades, it lets you see grade trends. What are some other parts of the application pieces that end up counting quite a bit in the evaluation?
Sure. Assuming everything, and you're absolutely right, as a seasoned veteran of the profession, absolutely. The coursework and end results, and that sets a tone for the application. In my estimation, over the many years I've done this, the single most important thing, other than looking at 3.5 years of high school work, is the storytelling and the manner in which the story is told that's in the first person. And here's what I mean by this. For example, we ask sort of the standard common application essay, and students have the menu to pick from what's available to them. And so good writing. And good writing starts with something very fundamental for me. You begin with the heading, what are you going to write about? A body of information where you throw it all in, and the all-important conclusion. I have read many essays where students tell a really good story at the outset, whatever it might be, about themselves, an experience, or something that's they've observed, and then it ends. And you want to know, well, what?
I call it the what versus the so what. So a lot of people deliver great what, be on the edge of your seat, and then there's no
And what difference does
yeah.
and I think for young writers and we're duty bound as adults to have a recognition that in most cases this is probably one of the few times, or maybe even the first time, a 17 or 18-year-old has to write, dare I say, a definitive piece. Right? They've answered essay questions for their classes, but this is in a way, and I don't want to oversell it, right? This is not the last time they're going to write something that's really important. This might be the first time where they've had to do a different kind of research, but remember your reader. You can bring your reader to a certain point. You don't want to leave them hanging, trying to, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? And so writers should be thinking about what difference does it make, or what conclusion do you want me to? So I spent a lot of time on that essay, but in truth, that extended essay is not the most important writing they're going to do.
I thought you were going here. Go ahead. You're on a roll.
Remember I said at the outset of this that students are doing two kinds of writing. Maybe I didn't say this, but I think about this all the time. There is how do you storytell over a page, or if there's a 600 word limit or whatever the school, how do you write that essay? And draw to a conclusion is the most important thing I want folks to take away from the three elements of that essay. But the more important writing is not the essay. As important as that essay is, it's that 2 paragraphs of why. Why do you want to attend X university? In this case, why do you want to attend UW-Madison? I'll let you in on 3 tips. Number 1, don't make it about jump around during football season. You can mention jump around, but that's not why you want to be here.
You might want to tell somewhere. Not everybody knows what jump around is. Why don't you tell jump around is at UW-Madison?
So jump around was actually started by one of our former football players. Actually, he was current football player at the time. There was this song in the mid-90s from a group called House of Pain. And the idea is that you just get up and you start jumping around to the beat. And this football player managed to, I don't want to reveal everything, but he somehow managed to get the folks in our press box to play the song. And on the field, all of the team players knew what was going to happen, right? He had set all of this up. And so when the song started playing, our team just started jumping around to the song, and it caught on like fire. And every home game between the end of the 3rd quarter and the start of the 4th quarter, and if your listeners can Google, if they've never heard of House of Pain, you can Google it, and from the minute it starts, the beat just gets you up. And then when the stadium rocks these days, it registers that it could be a small earthquake with the folks are jumping around and the players, even the visiting players. So anyway, I say all of that to get to this point. In the writing of why you're interested in university, this is an applicant's opportunity to really do 5 things. Number 1, you restate your case as I've learned, or when I went to visit, or dare you have friends with parents or neighbors, or you can talk about what you've learned is number 1 about the university. But it's not just that you've learned that we have 130 majors and many of our programs are ranked by different, all of that stuff. It's good that you know it and we should see it, but you've got to connect it to why it's appealing to you and what you're interested in. And again, that doesn't mean you have to know what you want to major in, but you really should know that you want a certain kind of learning experience, which is the second. To really reflect on what kind of learning environment you want to be in. And there are some things you'll know, right? That I've mentioned this. more than 30,000 undergraduates. So we're a big place and speak to it. And then third, if in fact and I've used this example before, you want to pursue a nursing degree, or you want to pursue animal science, and you understand our longstanding land grant mission, you can speak to those things. That is really powerful in helping us understand that you're not just sending off an application to a school that sounds good and you want to be at a good school. Who doesn't want to be at a good school? Number 4, I think, and this is the tricky part, try to imagine your audience and try to imagine an audience of one. And so what I think about when I say this is before pen to paper, remember that you are writing to a perfect stranger. And that's assuming, of course, that strangers are perfect. But that's a conversation for another day. This is someone that likely you've never met. They've never met you. They don't know you from anyone else, but you have an audience. And sometimes you don't get an audience in the way that writing an essay opens a door for you, which leads to the 5th and most important for me. And these are the transferable skills that students should learn in high school. Write, leave it alone, reflect, go away, have a milkshake, sleep on it, whatever you need to do to clear your head so when you read it, it actually reflects what you expected. And you'll be surprised, I think I need to go back to this sentence. It sounded good when I wrote it the first time, but upon reflection, maybe I need to do something different. And remember to keep it, again, some schools will give you word limit for this thing. I think you can get a lot done in 2 paragraphs if each sentence matters. And that is the ultimately for me, make each sentence matter.
Friends, this concludes the second part of my 4-part interview with Andre Phillips, the director of admission at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. We'll pick up next week and continue as Andre continues to talk about the importance of writing in the application.
And now it's time for our College Spotlight of the Week.
So, Kevin, why don't we segue and transition to talking about schools in New Zealand? I've learned from you that there are a tremendous amount of similarities with Australian schools, so it kind of made sense for us to kind of put them on the same, the same episode. So take it away, wherever you want to go with it.
Right. So like we talked about with the Australian schools, how we talked about the group of 8 being those that have the greatest international stature. There are only 8 universities in New Zealand, so it's quite easy to keep track of them all. But within those 8, there's a considerable amount of diversity. So if you want a city like Auckland or Christchurch, one of the big livable cities within New Zealand, that's very possible. In fact, the University of Auckland is very well regarded throughout the world. But something to keep in mind too is there aren't really a lot of losers when it comes to universities in New Zealand. Everyone's got a good reputation. Whatever metric you want to use, everyone does fine. And again, something I know a lot of people ask me about is accreditation, because all 8 New Zealand universities are public universities. There is that level of quality kind of ensured. But the thing I kind of want to talk about is just how different some of them are. Again, you've got a place like the University of Auckland that's in a larger city, but you've also got someplace that's very well regarded in the University of Otago, which is in Dunedin, which is on the South Island. It's quite far away from the major cities, and it's a student city. So really, at the risk of seeing a just quadrupling in the number of students who probably apply there every year, it's very much reminiscent of a place like St. Andrews in that it's kind of often by itself, but a student city, very student focused, and does some great work just across the field. The other thing I'd really like to mention is if you're looking for a place where you can have the opportunity to have that Australian style of education, which might be some bigger lecture halls in some cases, but at the same time still have those seminar opportunities. These are incredibly low staff to student ratios. In some cases, there's as little as 5 students for every staff member. So if you're looking for that, and probably the best part, in all honesty, is much like their Australian counterparts, they're not incredibly competitive as long as you can sell the fact that you want to go to a university in New Zealand. They're not looking for 33s on your ACT or perfect SATs or a bunch of AP scores. Again, a few AP scores in relevant topics, especially if you're looking at studying STEM, is a great way to prove your abilities and to make sure you're up to that international level. But again, you're not, if you can do the work and if you've got the passion for it, more than likely you've got an incredible opportunity to go there.
Talk to me a little bit about the mindset of the person that goes to New Zealand. Is it one of these things where they come to you and they say, hey, what about New Zealand schools? Or do they come and they start talking about Australian schools and you say, hey, if you're going to look at Australian schools, you may as well look at New Zealand schools? Or do they just in general say, I just want to do something adventuresome that's like really different, and maybe they're just wide open to other parts of the world, and then you kind of bring up New Zealand?
It's actually pretty funny. I was talking to a student I work with earlier today who he's currently in Australia, and he made the decision after looking at a lot of schools in Europe and then looking at schools in Australia and New Zealand that he was all in on the schools in Australia and New Zealand. And he said a lot of the things you just mentioned, that he's looking for an adventure. And he's looking for some place that sets him up well after graduation, but someplace that's not going to be even in his realm. And I obviously don't want to share too much about this individual, but he did not want to go someplace in England or Scotland or Ireland because he felt that it was too close to the beaten path. He wanted to do something just absolutely out there. And it's a perfect fit for him. So certainly students who want that adventurousness or who want the international experience, but they don't necessarily want Europe or they don't want Canada. They want someplace where their cheap flights are going to be to Southeast Asia or South Asia or East Asia. They want, or they have an interest in all those things in the outback that can kill you, which I prefer not to think about. But for whatever reason, it does tend to be students with a bit more of an adventurous tilt, or also students who feel that their testing and their ACT, SAT, APs kind of got in the way of their education. They're very passionate about their field. Maybe they found out what they were interested in late in high school, and they're solid B students, but they're looking for some place overseas that isn't someplace in the UK that expects really high performance on APs, or someplace in Europe that they may prefer to be in a society that speaks English.
And what kind of costs are we talking, Kevin? Give us a range of what you'd be looking at for both tuition and then meals and housing and fees.
A lot of it does come down, of course, to the exchange rate, because you look at the cost for international students, and those are big, scary numbers, at least for someone like me who's used to international schools. But the exchange rate is so favorable right now for Americans that you're still looking at living expenses, everything else, depending on where you go to university and what you study, between 40 and 50 US a year. In some cases, that can be considerably lower. And again, it is a matter of, do you want to do the honors year or do you not want to? So these can still be 3 years degrees. So you still have the opportunity to save there as well.
Now, I know you've talked about that before, the honors year versus not doing it, but I know some people may not have heard that those episodes. Can you just go over that again?
Right.
What that option is, and the pros and cons, kind of both ways. Yeah.
It's definitely more attuned to people who want to go on and do a research-based master's degree or do a PhD, or want to demonstrate to their future employer that they're capable of doing work at a higher level than just a mere undergrad, whatever that might entail. So if you're looking for an undergraduate degree to springboard into something else, and by something else, I mean a typical career, most cases you don't do the honors degree. If you decide later in life, or even a year or two later, you want to go on and do a master's degree, there are either conversion courses if you want to do them in Australia or New Zealand, or in some places they just don't care and recognize the BA or the BSc as the BA or the BSc. So it's not an absolute requirement by any means. But if you're the type of student who knows that you want to delve into something, and it can really set you apart.
And what would you say to the person that sort of works off of the assumption that if someone hasn't heard of a school, it may not be any good, and so they're really concerned about how employers are going to recognize this degree if they decide they want to come back and live in the U.S.? I'm sure that's not a question that you have not had before. And so what's your answer to that mom or dad that has that concern? Like, that's a university I've never heard of before, and most employers, the people I know, I don't think have heard of it either. So are they going to think this is some banana degree?
So I think the most important thing is that it is international experience, which a lot of employers really like to see, and a lot of employers are very happy to pay a premium for. I read a statistic somewhere that students who study abroad on average make 25% more over the course of their careers. So that is something to bear in mind. Additionally, chances are if they see a place that's in the UK or Australia or New Zealand or wherever, they're going to Google it. And something I really stress is finding that balance. There are people out there who approach me and they're just like, we want to find the absolute cheapest way for our student to earn a degree. And that's absolutely fine. But you've got to ask yourself, are you being penny smart and pound poor at the end of the day? There are some great bargains, and it's incredibly difficult to spend more overseas than you would absolutely have to here in the US. But it is a matter of balancing. So, something I do with, I at the risk of making this a little commercial, something I do with my students is we only look at the top 300 or so global universities unless we've got a good reason to do otherwise. The student who wants to go to New Zealand, just the generic student, may want to live there. So we can throw that out the window a little bit. So it's all a matter of what's the best fit for the student. I mean, you could have the most famous university in the world, be it Harvard or Michigan or the University of Texas or Oxford or Cambridge or the Sorbonne. And if it's not the right fit for your son or daughter, it's not the right fit for your child.
Well, let me follow up with the fit question. So you've already told us there's 8 schools there. I'm sure there's probably some differences when it comes to prestige and selectivity. I would think there usually is in some places. So like other than that, this most prestigious or the most selective school, what are some of the other things that would influence you to say, you know what, I think this New Zealand school may be good for you? I mean, one of them I know you've already mentioned, which is some are more located in cities than others. So let's take away sort of selectivity and campus setting as 2 criteria. What are some other factors that influence you? And once again, maybe if you could just say a word or two about a couple of the more, popular ones.
Right. I think a lot of it does boil down to, even if you don't know exactly what you want to study, what general direction do you want to go in? If, again, if you're looking at saying some place that's very prestigious and that you want to have a career in consulting or international finance or something like that, Auckland is probably the way to go. If you want to disappear off someplace and study something and still have a great career afterwards, then there's Canterbury or Otago or Victoria University of Wellington. If you want something more specialized, something that's just happened, it's probably the newest university in New Zealand is the Auckland University of Technology. And obviously, if you wanted to study something more STEM-based in a community that was more STEM-based, that would be a place for you to look at. So it does tend to matter a little bit on where you think your goals might be. But at the same time, it's very much based more on the individual preferences of the student. So something I'm constantly stressing, because it's hard enough to convince students to find, or not really convince, but to find the time in a student's schedule to go to a college visit here in the US. Now, so what that means is really we're looking, when you've got a situation where a university is an 8-hour flight or halfway around the world, leaning into those informal social media channels, not just the videos on university websites or what their social media is putting out, but the day in the life TikToks or Instagram reels, to see not just something I have to advise a lot of students of. Don't just find the attractive people. Don't just find the people you think are cute. Find the people who you think, I could be friends with this person. And could I see myself here? That's something to do.
Are there quite a few options for those for TikTok and Instagram Reels? Will they definitely be able to find those for pretty much every school, or hit or miss?
I think that certainly those in the English-speaking world, you're going to do a pretty fast business in. Once you start getting down to, although it's not a topic for today, the Charles University in Prague, there are a fewer ones out there who aren't just like a study abroad or something like that.
All right, we'll leave Prague for another day. My last question, Kevin, has to do with admission processes and sort of how that works. Is it just kind of a straightforward test scores and APs, or are there essays or interviews? Like what factors are being considered in their admission process? And is it the same for all of the 8 schools, or is there a difference amongst them?
Generally speaking, it's quite similar to what you would see in Australia, where their test scores and GPAs are taken into account, but the thresholds for the test scores at least are considerably lower than what you might expect. As for the APs, those are best used on something that's perhaps, like I said, more STEM-based in character. Just, again, as if anything else, just to make sure that you're not about to be in a difficult situation wanting to be an engineer, but not exactly knowing what trigonometry is. That's not setting you up for success. Just the same as I'm sure you could speak to this. I would assume that a lot of American engineering programs want to see you have taken at least pre-calculus, if not calculus.
Yes, definitely.
So definitely. But again, there's no rankings that are driven by rejection rates. And while the universities do tend to be smaller, I mean, I think, let me get the exact count of undergrads actually. There are places that have as few as 3,000 students, which, in fact, the biggest university in New Zealand is the University of Auckland with 33,000 students, equivalent full-time students, a bit more than that when you take into part-time and things like that. But they've got the space to have people, and New Zealand is, we think of it as being right next to Australia, but you're still looking at a several-hour flight. They want those international perspectives, and they definitely want American perspectives too.
Well, let's leave it there. I think that's great. On an uptick. This has been great. I was just thinking, we started this podcast 6 years ago. Didn't know I'd be talking to you here about New Zealand universities. So I feel like we've come a long way. Really appreciate you coming on. I'm excited to see what you've got in store for us on your next iteration. But thanks, Kevin, for all you do, my friend.
Oh, my absolute pleasure, Mark. Always good to be on.
Be well. Friends, on Monday's episode 316, we haven't made a decision yet whether we'll be doing higher ed updates or a question from a listener, but we'll have one of the two. And then we will start a brand new interview. And the interview is with Julia and Jonathan. They're at MIFA.org, two of the leaders at MIFA.org. And we're going to be learning a lot about 8 awards. And it's a 3-parter. And I hope you'll join in to listen to this, very timely right now as students are making their final decisions about colleges that they select. And friends, remember, it's not where you go. It's not where you go. It's not where you go, but it's what you do when you get there. It's what you do when you get out of there. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joyce Ducker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcast. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.